Millions of Americans may be blocked from voting due to overly strict voter ID laws. But who exactly is left out? Lauren Kunis of VoteRiders is here to explain. Welcome back to Defending Democracy. I'm Marc Elias. Let's get started. Lauren Kunis, welcome to Defending Democracy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So let me start by asking you kind of a question that a lot of people always have, which is, people know that in some states you need voter ID to vote, in some states you don't need voter ID to vote, and they kind of ask, like, what's the big deal? Like, what's this whole fight over voter ID all about? Why is it an issue? So, like, how do you tell someone who is watching this podcast for the first time, like, how they should think about this issue?
Yes, it's a great question, and one that, as you rightly note, we get frequently at VoteRiders, where we are a national voting rights organization focused on the issue of voter ID. 38 states have voter ID laws in place right now. That's more than ever before in our country's history, and 18 states have actually passed newer, stricter ID laws since 2020 alone. So the impact of voter ID laws and why they are such a big deal is twofold. One is because they directly disenfranchise eligible voters who don't have the specific form of ID that they need to cast a ballot in their state. And a second reason for which they're a big deal is because of the extent to which they cause massive confusion and intimidation and an additional informational micro barrier for eligible voters getting out there to cast a ballot. No state has the same voter ID law as any other state. ID laws are different for voting in person versus voting by mail, particularly for young or infrequent or first-time voters. Voter ID laws cause tons of confusion across the country, and they can lead to a poor experience at the polls where at best you have to cast a provisional ballot or you go home and get the ID that you forgot to bring, but at worst you're turned away from casting a ballot. So we at VoteRiders see this from our work over 12 years and in the 8 states where we have staff on the ground, but really from supporting voters nationwide. We see the very harmful impact that the rising tide of voter ID laws has had and continues to have on eligible voters.
So, Lauren, one of the things you said really resonates with me, and before we get into the details of like all these different ID laws and how they interact with one another, I don't think people understand that voter ID laws particularly hit young voters and first-time voters hard. And I wonder if you could like explain more about that and why that demographic specifically tends to be among the hardest hit.
Yeah. Absolutely. So we recently partnered with the Brennan Center for Justice and the Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement at University of Maryland to do the first national study in almost 20 years on who lacks ID in America today, what the barriers are, and what eligible voters know about ID laws in their state. And we found that age was the single most powerful predictor of whether or not someone had an unexpired ID with your current name, address, and gender on it. And there are lots of reasons for which this is the case. If you think about it, younger people are far more transient. They're more likely to move. Many attend college or university outside of the home where they grew up and don't get around to changing their license. There's also been a lot of interesting research lately on young people being less interested in driving than their older peers for a bunch of different reasons. Some of it is you're more connected via the internet and social media to your friends and don't need to drive. Other is the proliferation of rideshare platforms, so less of a sort of day-to-day need to drive and less interest in doing so. And also the sort of informational and cost and time barriers that you need to navigate complex bureaucracy and access a DMV that might only be open during working hours during weekdays when you're at class or working your first job. And the $50 to $100 it can cost to get an updated state ID, especially if you need to get a birth certificate to back it up. Those can be powerful barriers for all eligible voters, but for our youngest voters in particular. And one of the reasons we at VoteRiders have such a focus on young voters, in addition to the sort of disproportionate harm that ID laws wreak on them, is that we know that you're more likely to be a voter for life if you vote early. If the first time you're eligible to cast a ballot, you do so, you have a positive experience at the polls, it's more likely to be sort of baked into your identity and more likely to be a behavior that you repeat year after year.
Yeah, so I just want for our listeners and viewers to understand what Lauren is talking about. I had this experience in my own family recently. I'm like a nationally known lawyer around voting rights and voting rules, and yet when confronted with this circumstance, I did what most people did. I took to Google. My son is at the University of Wisconsin at Madison in graduate school. And so the question was, can he vote in Wisconsin? And so I went and I dutifully looked on the website. And this is what the University of Wisconsin tells its students. If you are a U.S. citizen with will be 18 years of age on or before Election Day and have resided in Wisconsin for at least 28 days before Election Day, you may be eligible to vote in Wisconsin. Okay, so far, so good. All true. Wait. Acceptable forms of identification to vote include a valid Wisconsin driver's license, Wisconsin state ID, U.S. passport, U.S. uniform service card, veterans ID card, tribal ID, or certificate of naturalization, the WIS card, which is the state issued ID by the State University of Wisconsin. Okay, this is like a state issued card because it's a state university. The WIS card or an out of state driver's license are not valid as voter ID. And then it goes on, like more and more, and then it ends with you can obtain the free University of Madison voter compliant ID by visiting the WIS card office during normal hours of operation, which basically says the University of Wisconsin can issue you an ID that would be qualified for voting, but the normal ID they issue you is not eligible for voting. And I'm left thinking, I'm sorry, why on earth would that be?
Right, exactly. So if you are your child and your father, I imagine, will not accept you not voting, you find a way to navigate that bureaucracy. But I think it's very understandable that an average first-time voter who's at the University of Wisconsin has a lot going on campus, isn't feeling particularly enthused about certain candidates, they look at that and they're like, oh, that's a lot of effort to do something that I thought was my basic, citizenship-derived freedom to vote. And I will say, to your point on Wisconsin, like, Wisconsin is a pretty egregious offender in the sort of, does my student ID work as voter ID overlay, but that really mirrors what we see across the country. There has been an attack on the ability of students to cast a ballot. One easy way to do that and sort of demographically gerrymander the electorate, if you will, is to strike student ID from the list of accepted IDs at the polls. And that's sort of, layered on top of or before of like taking polling sites off of campuses. We have a whole resource on our website, a sort of dedicated landing page that's available at voteriders.org/student that is specifically designed for students trying to understand, can I vote with the ID that I have from my state? If not, how can I figure out how to make a plan to vote? How do I get in touch with VoteRiders for this? Another example where we see a lot of confusion on campuses is in Georgia, where you can use your student ID to vote if it's from a public college or university, but not a private one. And coincidentally or not, most of the state's HBCUs are private colleges and universities. So really just a lot to unpack, particularly for students who attend college or university outside of where they grew up and where they might need to take additional steps, particularly if their student ID does not work for voting.
Yeah, and the thing that I always say to folks who ask is that we think about voter suppression, I think, in the wrong frame, right? Because people think of voter suppression as an absolute barrier from voting, right? Mm-hmm. It is something that prevents people from voting. What voter suppression is it makes it hard enough to vote that for some number of people, it is simply not worth the transaction cost. Mm-hmm. So, I sometimes use the example with folks like, how long would you wait in line to vote, right? Mm-hmm. Because you'd wait in line to vote if it was 10 minutes. Maybe you'd wait in line to vote if it's an hour, but you probably wouldn't wait in line to vote if it was 7 hours, right? So lines can be a form of voter suppression, and for different voters, they have different tolerances for how long they'll wait, but it's voter suppression along a continuum. And the same thing with these ID laws. You mentioned what I just read and what it means to, like, my son versus someone else. I mean, like, I think for a lot of people, a lot of students, they're reading that and they're like, you know what? Like, honestly, I don't want to get in trouble. I don't need the hassle. Like, this is all very confusing. Like it's just not. So it's suppressive, not just because they couldn't get the ID, but it's suppressive because the additional uncertainty and hurdles around the process just make it unattractive enough that they're not willing to go through the trouble. And I assume you see that all the time.
100%. I mean, convenience matters so much when it comes to voting because logically, it's almost like fundamentally an irrational act to vote. You know, the chances that your individual vote is the one that is going to tip the scales on an election outcome, it's not impossible, but it's more likely that it's not going to do that. So convenience really matters in sort of helping people make the decision to cast a ballot. And it's all of these little things that layer on top of each other. It's, can I vote early on the weekend when I don't have to work, when my kid, when I'm not taking care of my kids? Can I use the ID I already have, or do I have to spend like hours at the DMV and pay $50 to get the ID that I need to vote? Can I register on the same day as election day? It's sort of like a much broader system, but voter ID laws are unfortunately really front and center in the informational and document-based barriers that keep people away from the ballot box for sort of direct and a little bit more indirect but convenience-related reasons.
So I've noticed, Lauren, that the latest and greatest new voter suppression technique that we see, both at the state level, unfortunately, in some states where we've seen this, and actually my law firm and I have litigated against some of these in states, but also now as proposed at the federal level, are these proof of citizenship laws, which honestly are unbelievably pernicious. I mean, it's just incredible. And the bad faith messaging that the other side is doing around this. So tell me a little bit about how you guys see those laws and how to approach them.
Yeah, so as you rightly noted, the new sort of trend in voter suppression, when particularly we're looking at ID, is to put forth bills that call for documentary proof of citizenship in order to register to vote. So documentary proof of citizenship is something like a U.S. birth certificate, a naturalization certificate, a U.S. passport, or certificate of citizenship. So very sort of vital, precious documents that I don't carry those around with me when I'm at the farmer's market and see the person registering people to vote, and no one should, frankly. So we did research, as I mentioned, with the Brennan Center and the University of Maryland that looked at documentary proof of citizenship, and we found that over 21 million people, so about 9% of voting age citizens, didn't have easy access to proof of citizenship. So this means either they don't have that form of document at all, or if they had to show it tomorrow, they couldn't do it. So, it's important to remind everyone once again that when you register to vote, you have to attest under penalty of perjury that you are a U.S. citizen. Non-citizen voting in federal elections is incredibly rare to the point that it is like 0.0000. I don't even know how many zeros, but I mean, it doesn't happen. So the fact that once again we are creating incredibly burdensome laws or putting forth ideas for those laws to solve for a problem that doesn't exist, but that we know will create huge problems for millions of people, it's counter to, the very essence of American democracy and trying to expand the electorate and make it easy to exercise your freedom to vote. I think there's also a really pernicious and xenophobic sort of overlay to all of these. The sort of non-citizens are trying to steal the election, and it's really, I would argue, with really poor intent. It's seeking to sow mistrust in election results when we know that is not warranted. And at the federal level, the SAVE Act was passed by the House, but it doesn't look like it's going anywhere, at least right now. So it's not going to become law at the federal level. But troublingly, what we're seeing is copycat legislation pop up at the state level. And I think when state legislatures come back into session in 2025, we're going to see more of that. Arizona right now is the only state that requires documentary proof of citizenship to to participate in some elections, but Louisiana just passed a documentary proof of citizenship law that'll go into effect next year, and I'm sure we'll see more of that, which again is just sort of the latest innovation that will have an extremely disenfranchising and confusing effect on eligible voters.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the undercovered stories of, frankly, of 2024.
Yeah.
Because it's a threefer. It's a threefer for vote suppressors. Number one, they get to, as you say, they get to marry into an overall xenophobic and anti-immigrant fervor.
Yeah.
So they get that, and they get to marry with that an effort to perpetuate the big lie, right, of illegal voting, right? So they merge those two. But then the kicker is electorally, who does this impact? This impacts first-time registrants. Because, like, honestly, let's just have real talk here for a second. Unless you have a passport, then how the hell are you going to prove citizenship? Right? Like, I don't have my birth certificate. Like, if I needed to produce my birth certificate, I'd have to go to the state of New York and be like, can I have a copy? Why? Because my parents died, and I'm sure they had the original birth certificate, like, on paper someplace. But, like, who the hell carries their birth certificate? Who has their birth certificate handy? So if you don't have a passport and you don't have a birth certificate and you were born in the United States, right? Forget about all of the rest of it. Like, you're born in the United States. How the hell are you going to prove citizenship? Yeah. So we think about these proof of citizenship laws as if somehow they're targeting people who have immigrated to the United States. No, they probably have the easiest way of proving citizenship because they probably have their immigration naturalization paperwork.
Right.
But this is an effort to disenfranchise young first-time registrants. And it's going to succeed in doing that if we don't take these things seriously. I'm proud that my law firm sued and struck down part of that Arizona law. But you're right. Absolutely, Lauren. We are seeing this around the country. While I have you, I can't not ask you about other federal legislation. You mentioned the SAVE Act, which is was introduced and passed by the Republicans as an effort to make it harder to vote. We had the Freedom to Vote Act, the For the People Act, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, all of which failed last Congress. How do you see the role of federal legislation in all of this?
I think it's a really important safeguard for making sure that we have minimum standards across the country that make our democratic processes and electoral processes equally accessible to all voters. And I think with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act starting in 2013 and, getting even worse recently, it's even that much more important. So I retain hope that in the years to come, we will be in a better place to see passage of federal voting rights legislation that can support voters across the country, no matter what states throw at them, in being able to cast a ballot more easily.
We'll be right back with more of our conversation with Laura Kunis in a minute, but I want to tell you about this opportunity to subscribe for free to Democracy Docket's daily and weekly newsletters. Click on the link above. Okay, so now let's talk about the constituent pieces about ID, because whenever I am in a debate or in a discussion with someone on the other side of this or someone who's genuinely wants to engage, I always start by saying, okay, tell me what you are trying to prove for. Like, what is the thing you are trying to solve for? And then maybe we can actually find a way to, like, meet in the middle here, right? Like, what is the thing you think the idea is doing? Right. Because at one end of the spectrum, the idea is just trying to, presumably, not just one end of the spectrum, like, what it legitimately is trying to do, and for the proponents of it, is trying to prove that the person who says they are the person before the polling official is that person, right? It's just trying to prove identity. And there are lots of ways we can prove identity in this country. Photo ID is one way to do it, but it's not the only way, right? I mean, one of the other ways we prove identity in this country is to have someone who knows them say, yep, that is the person who they say they are. That's Marc Elias, I know them. Another way is to have people swear an affidavit, say, yep, I am this person, right? They may be able to produce a credit card or a utility bill that says, look, I have this bill and I wouldn't have this bill if I wasn't the person I said I am. At the other end of the spectrum, you have some of these ID laws, though, that seem to be proving not just that they are the person they are, but a whole lot of other information that honestly is not relevant to voting. Like, for example, a student ID can prove that the person is who they are. They may not have a date. An out-of-state license, by the way, like it has always struck me as irrational that a license from Texas is not as good to prove ID in Wisconsin. I mean, it's sure as hell good enough to prove that you are who you say you are in Texas, right? So what is it how do you all think about this issue of like what these ID laws are trying to get at?
Yeah, it's hard for me to sort of put myself inside of the head of a legislator who might be a strong proponent of voter ID laws. I will say, as you noted, voter ID laws for in-person voting are designed to prevent so-called impersonation or voter fraud at the polls. And that is a problem that simply does not exist. It is so vanishingly rare that when it does happen, it almost becomes a news story because it's such a sort of silly outlier. Voter ID laws are oftentimes framed by advocates like VoteRiders as a solution in search of a problem, but what they actually do is cause huge problems way beyond the scope of what they're allegedly trying to solve for. Another argument that I hear a lot that I really want to push back on is that we need stricter ID laws to build trust in elections. We have a crisis of trust in election integrity in America today. And I feel so strongly that the way to build trust in elections is by making them easy for everyday people to access without having to try incredibly hard and spend hours researching what you need and hours at the DMV getting a driver's license from a state that you don't even really want. It's about building trust by making elections accessible and participatory. And we know ID laws are hardest hitting for lots of the very same communities, like communities of color, that have far more valid reasons for feeling they're not being invited into the process and that they are being targeted and shut out. So, the passage of voter ID laws, particularly since 2020, you can draw a really direct line from lies about election integrity, trying to sow mistrust in election results, and the unnecessary ID laws that have passed since then that are keeping millions of Americans away from exercising their right to vote.
Yeah, I agree with you. Look, I mean, it is like the arsonists complaining that there are too many fires. Like, like the reason why there is distrust in the elections is because people on the right have sowed distrust in the elections. The reason why people believe that the outcome of the 2020 election was somehow in doubt or tainted in some fashion is because the right wing has spent 4 years lying about the outcome of the elections.
Right.
And the solution to that is not to clamp down on voting. So adding additional requirements like voter ID, by the way, at the same time that you're doing things like making it harder to vote by mail, making it harder to use drop boxes, like all the rest of it, it's just disingenuous. And so, but that is, kind of the world in which we live. You mentioned voters of color, and I wanted to get to them before I digressed further onto students. So we talked about young voters. What are the other groups that tend to be most disadvantaged by these ID laws?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we partnered with the Brennan Center and the University of Maryland to do a comprehensive study on who lacks ID in America today. And we, of course, unsurprisingly, but very unfortunately, found that certain communities are more impacted by ID laws than others. So the sort of big picture finding is we learned that 34.5 million voting age citizens, or about 14.5% of people, don't have an unexpired photo ID with their current name and address on it. We found age to be the most powerful predictor, but we also found that citizens of color were almost 4 times more likely to be without that form of ID than white adult citizens. We found that low-income individuals were more likely to lack ID. People who self-identified as having a disability because of access challenge to getting an ID and less of a need or ability to drive, for example. made them more likely to lack ID. Something that we also see in our work a lot is that women who change their name because of marriage or divorce often end up in this tricky situation where you need to get a name change document and then you need to update your license, but you registered under your maiden name and it gets quite complicated at the polls. Same for trans and non-binary individuals whose name and gender may not align with what they were when they originally registered to vote. And we also found that seniors who no longer drive, so age 80 plus, for example, were far more likely to lack ID. So there is a very sort of distorting factor that voter ID laws play. They distort the electorate to make it look sort of whiter and higher income and older than the average American. So we really end up with an electorate that doesn't look and feel like all of us, and that undermines our sort of the representative nature of our democracy writ large. But I mean, I would want to sort of uplift the fact that absolutely, like, young people in communities of color and already underrepresented groups are most harmed by voter ID laws. But when we're talking about 34 million Americans, that's not only young people or only Democrats, or it's everyone. There are millions of Americans from across the country and across the political spectrum, spanning ideologies and partisan affiliations, that don't have the ID that they increasingly need to vote. So it really sort of, I always like to recenter the conversation and say, this is hurting all of us in our shared democracy, so what can we do about it?
Yeah, and I'm really glad you mentioned women with maiden names, because I bring this up all the time, and it always shocks people. That if you look at whether it is ID laws, whether you look at absentee ballot rejection rates, like whose absentee ballots get rejected. Well, one of the reasons why absentee ballots get rejected is because of signature matching laws. And so whose signatures don't match, inevitably you see the highest impact in those laws among young voters. First and foremost, why young voters tend to not use signatures the same, don't value consistent signatures. They also tend to register using digital signatures, right? Who else Black and Hispanics are rejected at higher rates than whites, so you get that. But then I always tell them, that women have a slightly higher rate of rejection than men, and the reason why is because of maiden names. They sign their name as their married name and they're registered under their maiden name, that gets rejected, right? Because the names don't match. And so these really laws, these have these kinds of effects on populations that people don't realize that they're going to have.
Yeah, and I think you alluded to this earlier, but the enabling environment for the passage of voter ID laws is very strong. Part of that is because of lies about election integrity and needing to push back on fraud, which we know doesn't exist. But it's also because public opinion across the aisle over the last decade or so has generally been more or less in favor of voter ID laws. So a lot of our work at VoteRiders, in addition to sort of voter education and helping voters get the ID one-on-one for free, is about sort of building empathy and understanding of the impact that voter ID laws have. And we do a lot of sort of capturing of individual stories of voters we assist to try and put a human face on the problem, and also illustrate the fact that lots of people that you don't think about are very impacted by these laws. But honestly, who among us has not avoided a trip to the DMV? I mean, I don't want to spend hours of my afternoon and $50. I mean, same with me, which is like a supreme irony. But when I needed to update my license after moving here in DC, it took me 2 trips to the DMV and back to get the right documents I need. I needed the deed to my house and a bill that I couldn't find. I only had it on my phone. It's ridiculous. And I'm a very motivated voter and very comfortable navigating government bureaucracy. So it's important to sort of, for all of us to sort of break out of the, bubble that we may live in that may be privileged and understand the impact that these laws have.
Yeah, and I'll warn everyone out there, like you, I recently went to the DMV. States have been required now, actually for a number of years, and it's been a very slow rollout, but it's going to be final to adopt what are called I think the Real ID it's called, but it's basically a secure form of ID requirements for driver's license, which, by the way, means getting a driver's license is a hell of a lot harder than it used to be. Even renewing my driver's license felt like I needed I needed a passport, I needed my birth certificate, I needed to then like find a bill with my name. Like it was like it's
Yeah.
an ordeal. So this is going to be a growing problem for people out there as this happens.
Yes, I will say, thankfully, Real ID is not required to vote in any state, but there are states, and like where I am in DC, where they will try and I think exclusively offer a Real
That's right.
ID.
That's what I'm saying, and that's going to be that's going to increasingly
Yeah.
be the case because you're not going to be able to get on an airplane without a real ID. So this is going to be a real problem. But Lauren, I want to ask you. We've talked, predominantly now about all the bad, all of the problems, but VoteRiders is actually solving this problem. Or if not solving, at least going a long way to ameliorate the problem.
Yeah.
So tell us about the work that VoteRiders does and like how it helps tackle what you and I have just spent the better part of a half hour describing as a big problem.
Yes. So at VoteRiders, we're really committed to being part of the solution. We know that in the very truncated time period that we have before Election Day, we are very focused on making sure that we have as big of an impact as possible, making sure that every eligible voter knows what they need to vote and knows how to contact us if they need free help getting it. So we're a national organization. We have staff on the ground in 8 states. That's Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Ohio, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Wisconsin. These are all states where, as I'm sure you can guess, electoral margins are likely to be very tight. They all have restrictive ID laws, and almost all of them have a new and stricter ID law since 2020 alone. So we are really, going full steam ahead. Our staff do lots of tabling events at campuses, at community resource fairs. We do a lot of site-based work at places like high schools and food banks and shelters, making sure that we're getting as much information out there as we can. We also do a lot of text banking and letter writing and phone banking, relying on thousands of volunteers from all across the country to make sure that at-risk voters in strict ID states know what they need to cast a ballot and how to be in touch with us if they need help. And yeah, importantly, we do one-on-one ID assistance. We put in the time and the resources needed to help eligible voters get exactly what they need to vote. And something that was really not sort of as front of mind for me until I started doing this work at VoteRiders is the extent to which an ID unlocks your ability to cast a ballot, but it also in many cases changes your life. And it lets you access employment in the formal sector, and it lets you access more stable housing for your family. So a really interesting and unique part of our work at VoteRiders is we're able to sort of use ID as our like a Trojan horse, if you will, and get in the door with unlikely voter engagement partners like direct service providers, nonprofit organizations that don't have voter registration and get at the vote front of mind. But when we say we want to bring free ID help to the community you serve, they're very, very interested. So yeah, voter education, voter assistance when it comes to ID. And we also do a lot of digital campaigns, communications efforts on radio, social media, movie theaters, really doing everything we can to meet as many voters as possible where they are with the information they need about changing ID laws in their state. We have really ramped up our work since 2020, in particular in response to this tidal wave of stricter ID laws that we've seen. We also know that many voters only turn out every 4 years in presidential elections. So the rules of the game have changed so dramatically since 2020 for so many voters. And that's why we are an always-on organization making sure that ID laws don't keep anyone away from the ballot box this November or after that.
So I like to ask guests a question that I want to ask you, which is, why did you get into this work? It's got to be like of all of the things you could be doing with your life. I understand the rewards to it, but it's also a very challenging area. Like just at a personal level, like why did you decide that democracy work was like the thing that you would dedicate your career to?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, some of my earliest political memories are door knocking with my dad, and my mom was a public school teacher, and I remember standing in the school parking lot right outside of the polling station, but not closer than we should
Not
be.
too close. Not
Uh,
too close.
exactly, right on the line. Encouraging people to vote in favor of passage of the public school budget every year. So I think I was brought up in a political household, but one that was political from a sort of more nonpartisan issues perspective than sort of political per se. Um, I spent almost a decade doing democracy work overseas, working at the World Bank and the National Democratic Institute, working on very developing democracies or even emergent democracies, conflict afflicted countries like Syria and Iraq. Um, and following the 2016 election in particular, I felt like my own democracy, the one that my two little kids will inherit someday, was really at unprecedented risk. So I stopped doing this work overseas and started channeling my energy and effort every day into building up a democracy here at home that I think is more reflective of the promise of our country and what we can continually move forward towards.
And finally, people watch these interviews, they listen to you, they are inspired. I get a lot of comments about how inspired they are by our guests. But overwhelmingly, the biggest question that I get is, what do I do? Like, I feel so helpless by all of this. It all sounds so daunting. It all sounds so worrisome. Let's assume I am someone who has an ID, right? So I always tell people, check your registration, make sure you're registered, have a plan to vote, make sure you know what the requirements are, all of that. And they are like, yep, got all that, but I want to help.
Yeah.
Like, what do I do to help?
Yes, we are all about turning nervous energy and anxiety into action because we don't have time to waste. So yeah, absolutely. First thing any individual can do is check their registration, make sure they have the ID they need to vote in their state. Heads up that it might have changed recently. If you're all good there, remind your friends, your family, your community, your coworkers. I feel like we all focus a lot on like how do we get Taylor Swift to tweet this and how do we get sort of like the big influencers, but I feel like something that is really often overlooked is that every single one of us has the unique power to mobilize two or three people, in your family or your coworker who really doesn't want to vote, but if you force them along with you, they'll come. So really sort of think about who in your circle might not vote but needs a little nudge from you to do it. Of course, at VoteRiders, we can't do this work on our own. We don't want to do it on our own. If you are with a partner organization that is interested in bringing ID help to your community, you can contact us on our website at info@voteriders.org. Similarly, and I should have mentioned this earlier, we have a ID helpline that you can call or text. It's 866-ID, the number 2 vote. So anyone with questions or needs help getting an ID, you can send them that way. Beyond the sort of activating your circle to vote, we're always looking for volunteers. Go to our website under the volunteer tab and you can sign up to be notified of 2 to 4 to maybe even more virtual 1-hour text banks and letter writing parties that we're going to be doing now through Election Day to the states that I mentioned earlier. And of course, we're a nonprofit organization. We are reaching voters that are oftentimes overlooked by parties and campaigns. So we welcome tax-deductible donations of any size. Every dollar makes a difference as we try and do this work at increasing scale across the country in response to the really unprecedented need.
I encourage everyone to support VoteRiders. All of the links that Lauren mentioned are in the show notes, so you can get access to them. And in addition to, as she said, these organizations like VoteRiders, this is the Super Bowl, right? This is like they need every resource they can get. So if you have a few hours, give them a few hours. If you have a few dollars, give them a few dollars. Like, this is the time where they are going to shine and they are going to do real concrete work to affect the lives of Americans. You know, to the difference between the trajectory of someone's life when they are actively engaged and welcomed into the civic world of voting, into being a voter, having a stake in, having that as part of their stake in society, and feeling like they have been excluded from that aspect of society. It has life ramifications, as Lauren pointed out, that for a lifetime, across a range of things that are even go beyond just the outcome of any one election. So please, everyone, support VoteRiders every way and any way you can. Lauren, thank you for joining today, and thank you for all of the incredibly important work you do.
Thank you. It takes a village, so we're glad to be in it.
Great. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Defending Democracy. Please stay up to date on the latest voting rights and democracy news with our free daily and weekly newsletters. We'll see you next time.